Hello, can you hear me? It's a smaller room that's left, but how you folks feeling? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. I feel you if you're over here. I totally get it. It's been an incredibly rich 3 days, and I'm deeply grateful for those of you who've stuck around, not only for day 3, but especially for this panel that is very near and dear to my heart, as well as everybody else on this stage, and a conversation that I think could be its own conference. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Maybe we'll get there. For the last 3 days, we've had really meaningful and diverse conversation around all the ways in which folks across the world, specifically in America and Canada, are offering care across the various intervention stages, across different practices, different places in which this work is critical, from internet regulation to video games to probation and rehabilitation. But what we haven't really done is look at each other and look inwards about the care that we offer or don't offer to those that do this work. And so it is my great honor to moderate this conversation called Protecting the Protectors as a tertiary care provider myself. My name is Kamal, I use he, him pronouns, and I get to be a restorative justice practitioner living, working, and playing on the Indigenous territory that is Ontario, Canada. And it is my great pleasure to introduce these incredible panelists who I will do now. On my right is the one, the only, Jillian Hunchak. Jillian works as a research analyst at the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. She specializes in gender-based violence, including the involuntary celibate or incel movement and violence against 2S LGBTQIA+ persons and communities, in addition to the far right, conspiracy theories, and mis, dis, malinformation. Give it up for Jill. Next to Jill is Robert Mundy. Robert Mundy is a social worker with 10 years of experience in community mental health. He specializes in trauma-informed care for children and young adults. His work has included service to refugees, survivors of trafficking, children in the adoption system, and individuals leaving extremist movements. Robert currently supports the work of the de-radicalization nonprofit Life After Hate. He believes that hate is everyone's problem to solve, and a healthy community is everyone's right to enjoy. Give it up for Robert. And last but certainly not least, we have Michael Becker. Michael is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology at American University in Washington, D.C. His research interests include the individual and group correlates of support for and participation in violent extremism, process and outcome measures in PCVE programming, and theoretical testing. His work has been featured in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the European Journal of Criminology, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Criminology and Criminal Justice, and Terrorism and Political Violence. For those credentials alone, give it up for Robert. Michael, sorry. Let's dive into our conversation, for which we have about 28 minutes to have, and I'm super excited. So let's get started. I'm wondering if the panelists can start, any one of you, with a story that helps us understand why this conversation specifically is so important to you. Anyone?
I'd be happy to start.
Yeah, please, go ahead, yeah.
Okay. This is, it's important for all of us, and I think we all have a story that relates back to our well-being and doing the work in this space, but there's one experience in particular that stands out to me. When I started my career about 6 years ago, I had the incredible opportunity to work with Moonshot, which, if any of you aren't familiar, I'm not gonna butcher their total mission, but please go look them up, they're fantastic. And one of the things that's so wonderful about them is that they have a very intentional focus on protecting the people that work for them, the research and analysts in their space. Michael and I worked there together, he can testify to that. So I didn't come into this space completely unaware of the harms that were a risk doing this work. I looked at incel spaces, we looked at a lot of militia movements in the US, and we spent a lot of time in really distressing spaces online. But I felt that we were prepared for it to some degree. Or I can only speak for myself, I guess. A few years later, I had moved on to a contracting job where I was looking into terrorism financing and doing research for a book as a contractor. And one of the cases that I was looking into was Alexander Bissonnette, who, if you're not familiar with him, is the perpetrator of a mass shooting at a mosque in Quebec City in 2017. And the goal of this research was to go in and try to find clues as to how these small-scale attackers had financed their attacks. And so I was doing open source research. I was looking online at their social media profiles, any mention they had made of, coming into some money, or trying to figure out timelines of when they might have acquired the weapons that they used. And I let my defenses down because this was a quantitative journey. And what ended up happening is that I stumbled upon the YouTube page of Alexander. And I went through his videos looking for clues, not realizing what I was getting into. And I started to see videos of this person who had a whole life before all of this overtook him. He had videos of squirrels climbing up the side of houses and commenting in the background that it was amazing that these squirrels could defy gravity like that. And there were videos of him in Niagara Falls with his family or sitting around a campfire. And I had gone looking for numbers, and I found a human being, and that broke me. It took quite a long time for me to recover from that, and in fact, I had to take some time away from that project, which felt ridiculous because it's a terrorism financing project. All you need to do is map out the data points, right? But I think we all know so often coming into these spaces that we are going to be faced with very acute harms. None of us are naive to that. What I realized in that moment and through that experience, though, is that there are so many harms that are lurking around corners that we don't expect. And we need to attack this from all angles and make sure that we are taking care of ourselves in every possible space.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks. I think, Robert, you said you wanted to.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that, Jill. That resonates with me a lot, too. I have an opportunity to talk to helpers in lots of other contexts outside of the world of countering violent extremism. What I've found in talking about wellness and talking about caring for yourself, I usually present this notion that I think people in here believe is foundational to their work, which is that people that you work with and work for and on behalf of have inherent human dignity. They possess this regardless of the choices they make, regardless of who they were before they came to you, that there is some capacity in them to deserve respect, that they deserve safety, and they deserve to be treated as human beings. And for helpers, this was easy to come by. I would work with groups as large as 500, and I would see head nods that, yes, of course, we believe in inherent human dignity. And I would describe some of my own experiences working for Life After Hate and the work I had done previously as a trauma therapist, and I would describe how I had carved out a single exception to that rule, and that exception was me. And that while I believe my clients had this quality, I didn't. I had to keep working all the time to save the world. I had to make sure that I was always available. I had to put myself in harm's way to make sure my community was safe. Things that I would never obligate my clients or my loved ones to do. And not only was I doing this, when I described making that exception for myself, I would also see head nods around the room, and I still do. And I was mentioning to my colleagues backstage, it'll be so wonderful the first day that I mention this story, and helpers say, oh no, that's not me. I don't do that. And I'll know the work is done. And I think of that as validation of the work that we need to do, but also an opportunity to be seen in this work, that this work we can expect to be draining and challenging, but there's great reward in acknowledging those challenges and working as best we can, a collaboration to solve it.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. Over to you, Michael.
Sure. So as Jill kindly mentioned, I also had an opportunity to work with Moonshot back in the lead up to the 2020 election, which, as we all know, resulted in a pretty hostile environment online. And that was the space that I was working in. And having done some work in academia looking at the incidence of violence, the kind of what support for violence looks like, and what people who mobilize to violence look like, I had an idea in my head of what that might look like in the real world, but it was more challenging to imagine how that environment online could translate to that. And so Similarly, I found myself kind of working in this space, trying to find how are we reaching these people, how are we connecting with them, and there was a few interactions that just, it always caught me. And I didn't know that it was going to catch me online because I live online. I'm of the generation that has always been on MySpace, Facebook, et cetera, right? And I thought I was immune to these kinds of interactions, this kind of vitriol that you see online. And when it is targeting your identity, or when it is targeting the people that you love, sometimes that can hit you in a way that you weren't expecting necessarily. And that really kind of jumped out at me. And since then, I've had kind of the excellent opportunity to work a little bit more in this from the academic space. And we're fortunate enough that my team at American University, led by the brilliant Dr. Joe Young and the fantastic Dr. Daisy Mwibu, was funded by EnSite to conduct some work specifically looking at how working in this space can actually impact us and what consequences that actually might have on our ability to be the best person in this space that we want to be.
Yeah, I think the piece that stood out from all of your shares, but specifically you, Michael, you just named it, is the role of identity in all of this. And you know, as a restorative justice practitioner that works specifically in identity-based harm, I have to leave room for the person who's experienced the harm to tell me what impact it's had, regardless of what assumptions I might be making when I see it in a Crown Prosecutor's summary or a police referral. I have to hold out and hold space for them to be able to share with me the ways in which they're impacted, because I don't know that. And so similarly, I have to offer that to myself, and we have to offer that to ourselves as practitioners and people who support practitioners for how this actually affects us and how that looks incredibly different. So I'm wondering to the panel is, what role does identity play in cultivating the culture and skill sets that are necessary to protecting the protectors? So can you speak to identity and this notion of protecting protectors?
I would love to, yeah. So my work at Life After Hate allowed me to work with families who had loved ones, usually children or young adults in their lives, who were in the process of radicalizing or had radicalized. And the vast majority of the people we were referred to were people interested in white supremacist violence, and so most of the parents I was working with were white. And what struck me in my work, as I was encountering my own relationship to my own whiteness, to my own privilege, to being a cisgender heterosexual man in a position of relative power in an organization where my other colleagues did not share those qualities and so faced greater risk doing the same work that I was doing. One of the biggest challenges in working with my families for their own healing and for their own support of a loved one who is engaged in extremist violence or thinking about it was white parents unable to recognize and make sense of their own whiteness. They lacked cultural competency of a sort in understanding the role of white supremacy in their lives outside of a hate movement. And as a result, they found themselves completely flummoxed by their child's choice to engage in conversations online with people that were quite willing to talk about whiteness and quite willing to talk about that aspect of their child's identity. And so part of, I would think of this as a sort of grief work for the families that I was working with, that there was this understanding of their place in a society that was perhaps different than what actually was, and their child's engagement in these behaviors or choices was leading them to come to new conclusions or need to come to new conclusions about whiteness in their lives. And that was challenging work, but it was also very hopeful work because it gave my families a sort of literacy, a legibility to understand what their child was going through and to give them an in to work with their children in a more rapport-based way.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, this is a complicated question. I think we will probably get to this in another section, but it comes down, I think, to a culture of accessibility that we need to build in this work, because all of us carry many different identities at once, and that means that there are an infinite number of ways that we can be harmed through looking at this work. I found, my background is researching incels, and I found that I had an easier time on the incel forums in the worst manifestations of this ideology than I did experiencing casual misogyny every day, because that was an indication to me that those spaces are still alive and well, and it was sort of, again, catching me off guard in terms of this is something that still exists. Queer people are, underrepresented generally in this space, minoritized communities generally, and I think it comes back, we are going to be so much more effective in the work that we do if we make sure that there's a diversity of people tackling this problem from all different angles. But we cannot make sure that that happens until we tackle the identity-based harm and implement the protective factors that are going to keep those diverse people safe. And it's a very tricky question. We have an endless number of ways that harm can occur when it comes to identity.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, and I guess, so putting my researcher hat on, one of the ways that I think about this is in terms of not only the identities, but some of the individual differences that we have. And while we've seen in some of our work, we had an opportunity to speak with 14 people who have worked and lived in the counterterrorism space, and we've heard from many of you. We had over 180 responses from the great people in the Prevention Practitioners Network. And one of the things that kept coming out is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and the way that we process these things is not one-size-fits-all. There are important individual differences, and in some cases, people are able to shoulder a little bit more, they process it on their own, and they're able to kind of make that work, but many times they need different kinds of resources. And so having access to those resources, when we all work in a space that is unfortunately resourced for certain kinds of outcomes, but not necessarily all outcomes, I think that that's a challenging kind of dimension of this that we should probably continue to have these conversations about.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. I'm slightly pivoting us because I recognize that many of you who are in this space, if not all of you, were staying around because you want these tools and practices that would enable, the care for ourselves and for each other. And at the same time, I would argue that just as important as the tools and practices themselves is the conditions that enable or disable those tools to actually be realized and implemented. And so I'm curious for the folks on this stage, because of the wealth of experience in building those containers and building the spaces in which those tools are actually useful and meaningful, I'm wondering if we can talk about more than just self-care. In most spaces I've been in where we talk about protecting protectors or safeguarding the wellness of practitioners, we often hear practices and recommendations around self-care. While self-care is critical, can you speak to the duty and the role of workplaces, managers, leaders, and teams to enable or disable self-care?
I can get started on that.
Please.
That's all right. So I have had an opportunity to be a part of this team for a bit, and one of the kind of add-on projects that we've been able to pursue is looking at some of the peer support structures that have been enabled by organizations and what the effect is that has had on reducing the stigma. But those types of interventions work when leadership buys in. And those types of interventions work when leadership models that they're open to it, that they're interested in making sure that these people have access to it. And I was speaking with someone earlier in this conference. It's always a bit of a blur as to exactly who, but a metaphor came up that I think really carries this, is that if you were to imagine the people in the counterterrorism space as soldiers, you would never send a soldier off to war without training them. You would never send a soldier off to war without equipping them. And you would never just say afterwards, well, we'll patch you up, but good luck out there. And so I think part of the duty of those in leadership is to provide that training, to provide those resources, and provide the ways to protect the people in the space so that it isn't just saying, well, we'll see you later, good luck.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, and I'm reflecting on what you're saying too about leadership culture, and I'm reflecting on my own previous experiences with leadership that modeled this well and didn't, and the pressures as human beings in these positions to, in some ways, work against your own best interests, answering emails when you shouldn't be, and obligating staff to do things because you're the one that has to fill out the grant paperwork that says which outcomes you received, and knowing that the pool of money is, in some cases, smaller and smaller each year. There's a lot of human pressure to do your best and be your best, especially in America's context, hugely individualized in the way we think about health and healing and pushing ourselves to always be better. But I really appreciate your framing in this, Kamal, because there is a pressure on us as helpers to imagine ourselves as solely responsible for the healthy outcomes that we're looking to create. In fact, when we are most distressed in our work, we may lean into it, paradoxically, more work for ourselves. Because wouldn't that be convenient if I could solve it all? I've done that countless times and led to 3 different burnouts as a result of it. I think there's a real opportunity for leadership, and I'm also going to shout out specifically middle management supervisorial roles to talk about the different and perhaps unique trauma that is faced by having borne witness not just to the crises of your clients, but the crises of your staff, and in some ways still not have the autonomy to make sense of that in your own work. And how that's going to show up in our shared mission to care for each other is huge. So thinking about the various levels of our work is equally important as our client. I think that the best outcomes we can create for our clients and our communities come from taking care of ourselves and being honest that we cannot solve this alone.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of your comments, and I think bringing this back to the identity question, because I think this is a pervasive line. I had a colleague that when I was doing my internship during my master's, older white cis male, someone who I think for all intents and purposes in this field could be, easily mistaken as someone who would have adopted this kind of culture of bravado, I think, that we tend to show up within this space. And this will always stick with me. I remember him talking about watching some really horrific videos and talking very openly to his colleagues and to myself about how he's experiencing secondary trauma and he needs to just back away from all of this and he needs to take care of himself. And that was so powerful as a young woman in this field because, I have gone into this space thinking and being very conscious about the fact that I don't want to be the girl who can't hack it. And hearing him, I think about him a lot, hearing him, express very openly that this is something that he just doesn't want to, that he can't deal with, and he is taking the steps to make it better for himself was so powerful. So I think in terms of institutions and managerial roles, I think it starts with changing the culture. That can be incredibly powerful when you have people in positions of privilege and power making that demonstrable in the culture. It's also, and similar to you, Michael, I had a conversation with someone or someone said something and it's a blur, but it's in there somewhere, had mentioned, actually I think it might have been you,
I can't remember the dude.
Making health and care just non-negotiable in workspaces. This cannot be something that is a last thought when we're building up these roles. And I think mental health care, as far as we've come in our general culture, there's still a long ways to go, but it is absolutely central to the work that we do. And we can put policies in place, we can put frameworks in place, which are all very good and important, but if we don't have that cultural shift, we're not going to be making space for people to come forward when they do feel uncomfortable, and we're not going to be making space for the diversity of the people that we need in this field to show up and do the work that they need to do.
Brilliant, brilliant. Recognizing time, and I also, recognize that there is a plethora of tools, resources, and toolkits in these folks' pockets. And so, both for my own sake and your sake, I'm curious about if you wanted to share some of those tools, toolkits, resources that you are, aware of with the rest of this audience to go back with. As a young tertiary practitioner myself, I'll be taking notes as they speak, so don't mind me.
Yeah, well, I'll do a quick plug for our working group.
Yeah.
If any of you caught us on the first day, thanks to the support of the summit, we do have a Protecting the Protectors working group, and over the last year, we have worked to create a handbook that is intended to be accessible. It's intended to be very comprehensive, to include all kinds of harms that can result from this work, and ways to mitigate them. We're going to be working with Rob to include the amazing resource that he's going to be talking about, and we're hoping to launch it within the next year or so as we gather feedback from all of you and refine it to something a bit more comprehensive. But if you're curious about, it's not launched yet, it's still in beta, I think, like the kids say. But if you want to see it, please come find me and I will send you a link and would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'll shout out that, yes. Working group, please join us. I developed a toolkit as well. I'm going to incorporate it in with Jill and her team. We're really excited, but we also need collaboration. As you're probably getting from us, we know we can't do this alone. So please, find us, get copies of it, give us your feedback, help us understand how it will specifically help you or not, and your teams. Thanks.
I don't know what else there is to add, but I guess I would take a moment to spotlight that there are some good practices that are already out there. And some of the best that I've seen have been from, to use kind of the quantitative term, a selected sample. The folks that I know and the folks that I've worked with, in particular, I know that the team at Moonshot have specific practices in place and tools and apps that you can just have as add-ons to your browser. Simple as that for those who work in the online space, to automatically mute videos when they pop up on your screen. So if you don't need to be hearing that, you're not hearing that. If you don't need to be seeing kind of the bright color contrast versions of some of these horrific images that you might be coming across, that's automatically grayscaled. And these are some of the kind of very, very basic things that we can add in, and some of the just first steps that can help people from kind of when they start getting interested in learning and doing internships in this space all the way through to kind of when they're managing folks and when they're really engaging kind of a broader space.
Thanks. I hope you folks captured that, and if you don't, we'll be around for a few minutes after the panel. Feel free to find these folks. I'm struck by, and I've been thinking about the words of Emma, I think Dr. Cordelli, I hope I'm saying that last name right, from Boston Children's Hospital yesterday on a panel. When she was asked, what the biggest challenge for her in this work is, she said, good people burning out, good practitioners, good frontline workers, good middle management, good upper management burning out in ways that weren't anticipated and in ways that don't feel good for anybody. And so I think about all the ways and how important this conversation is and how critical it is, and also how, what an honor it is to be able to have this at the stage. And I also think about the folks in this space that may be thinking, yeah, I hear that it's critical, but I don't know where to start. And so this is something of an improv question for you folks. And I'll keep talking to give you a second to think about it. But if you're in leadership, or if you're in front line, or somewhere in between, and you're thinking about, yes, I recognize it, I hear and I see all the ways that this work has impacted me, changed me in not so pro-social ways, and I want to do something about it. I want to facilitate and foster a culture at my workplace, at my agency, at my university, at my department, a culture that does protect the protectors, but I don't know where to start. Where might you recommend folks to start?
I would recommend, and this might be difficult work, but I hope also important work, remind yourself which parts of your job bring you hope, and identify what that balance is between the parts that bring you hope and that don't. And if that balance isn't feeling right, please know you don't have to do this. And I know that's hard to say in this room of overachievers like us. I see you, I hear you. You don't have to do this. And coming to an acceptance on that, and perhaps grieving that, is a really important part of your sustainability in this space.
It's profound. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, I think mindset shift is maybe important. Obviously, there are policies and tools that you can put in place, but something, I like to remind myself is that it's a marathon and not a sprint, and no one person can solve this issue alone. We were talking about this last night over dinner. Nobody comes to this space just because it's a job. No one gets up in the morning and gets ready to go to work at the counterterrorism factory. We're all here because we are so profoundly invested in the outcomes of this field. And that can make it a part of our identity. I think we've all probably experienced that in some way or another. And it's so important, I think, to remind ourselves that we need that separation. We are not going to solve this today. And having that mindset shift might allow us to sort of open up the space to bring in those policies and practices and toolkits that are going to help us cultivate more of a culture. And also where to start, come talk to us. Yeah. We have resources that we'll be able to give you if you have no idea, where to, and sorry, Michael, one more thing.
No, I'm just going to echo that. There's 4 people on the stage who I'm sure can give you a starting point. And that is part of what we've committed our work to do, I think it's fair to say. What we're passionate about as well is being able to find the things that work, and by being able to find the things that work for you. Because again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. If you're a 50-person organization that has 100 consultants that work with you. That's different than the small office that has 3 people and a part-time admin who's doing their darndest to keep the printer working. And I think that being able to find that specific solution and find the one that fits and fits your people is, well, come talk to us.
Thank you to all of you. Something I say in my work, especially when I'm working with clients or participants, is that I get to journey alongside people as they practice unskilled expressions of unmet needs. And we have unmet needs as well, and I am grateful for this esteemed panel in animating what filling those needs could look like. And I wish you folks all the best in pursuing an attempt to meet those needs so you can continue to meet the needs that you do meet. Thank you, Jill, Robert, Michael. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.